She has been surviving for 6 years. Never living, never breathing, just enduring, shift after shift, bill after bill, invisible to everyone around her. Then one rainy Seattle night, the most dangerous man on the West Coast walked through the door. Conversations stopped. Grown men straightened their spines. Even the air in the room changed. Dante Moretti didn't just enter a restaurant. He entered like a man who owned everything the light touched and everything the darkness hid. And when Evelyn Cross looked up from her tray and met his eyes for the first time, she had no idea that one moment was about to dismantle every wall she had ever built around herself. Stay until the end. You won't see this ending coming. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came in sideways that Tuesday night, the kind that didn't just fall but attacked, driving hard off Puget Sound and slamming against the tall glass windows of Bella Rosa like it had a personal grievance with everyone inside. The waterfront restaurant sat at the edge of Seattle's Elliott Bay, all exposed brick and warm amber lighting and the kind of curated elegance that made people feel wealthy just by proximity. White tablecloths, hand-blown glass pendants, a wine list that read like a geography lesson for people who had never needed to check a price tag in their lives. Evelyn Cross had worked here for 3 years and had never once eaten a full meal at one of those tables. She moved through the dining room at 9:47 p.m. with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to disappear into the background of other people's comfort. Her black uniform was pressed. She always pressed it the night before, even when she was too tired to stand, because appearing professional was the one thing she could control. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. Her shoes were 2 years old, and the left heel had a slight wobble she'd been meaning to fix since March. She hadn't fixed it because fixing it cost money, and money was always going somewhere else first. Table 12 wanted another bottle of the Barolo. Table 7 had a birthday. The kitchen had been worn twice and still hadn't sent out the dessert. Table 4 was a business dinner. 4 men in suits who spoke just low enough that she couldn't hear them, but loud enough that she could sense the tension radiating off the table like heat from a radiator. She handled all of it without breaking stride. That was the thing about Evelyn. She didn't break. She bent, constantly, at angles that should have been unsustainable. But she never broke. 3 years at Bella Rosa. 2 years before that at a diner on Aurora Avenue where the cook used to throw plates when the orders backed up. Before that, a coffee shop in Capitol Hill where she'd been 17 years old and solely responsible for keeping her 14-year-old sister Lily from falling through whatever crack the city opened beneath kids who had no safety net. Their mother had left when Evelyn was 20. Not died. Left. Walked out on a Wednesday morning with a duffel bag and a man named something she no longer bothered remembering and simply never came back. Their father had been gone longer than that. A ghost she'd stopped trying to summon somewhere around age 12. So it had been Evelyn and Lily. Always. And tonight Evelyn's feet hurt. Her lower back was a steady, grinding complaint she'd been ignoring for 4 hours. And the kitchen was backed up by 12 minutes on every ticket, because Marco, the sous chef, had called out sick, and the replacement didn't know the menu well enough to move with any speed. She'd already comped 2 tables for the delay. The floor manager, a soft-handed man named Dennis, who smelled perpetually of the same imported cedar cologne and contributed very little to anything, had disappeared into his office 40 minutes ago and hadn't emerged. Evelyn had been running the floor alone. This was not unusual. She picked up a ticket from the pass, balanced 2 plates on her left arm with the mechanical precision of someone who had done it thousands of times, and pushed back through the dining room. The ambient noise was the usual kind. Silver on china, low conversation, rain against glass, the faint strain of jazz from the speakers near the bar. She delivered the plates, answered a question about the halibut preparation without consulting anyone, refilled a water glass that hadn't been touched, and turned back toward the service station. That was when the front door opened. She didn't notice it immediately. The door opened and closed dozens of times on a busy night, and Evelyn had long since trained herself to tune out ambient movement unless it required her direct attention. She was rechecking Table 7's ticket when she registered the change in the room, the way you register a shift in barometric pressure, not through any specific sight or sound, but through a generalized alteration in the atmosphere. Conversations didn't stop. They lowered. She looked up. 3 men had entered. 2 were clearly security, large, composed, eyes moving in a professional sweep of the space that immediately cataloged exits and sightlines. They wore dark suits and the particular stillness of men who had been trained to neutralize problems before the problems knew they were problems. The third man walked between them, but not in the way that suggested he needed protection. He walked the way a man walks when the protection is more about the people around him than about himself, a kind of courtesy buffer between his presence and the rest of the world. He was tall, broad in the shoulders in a way that good tailoring almost successfully disguised. Dark suit, no tie, a white shirt open one button at the collar. Dark hair, clean cut, jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s at most. But his face carried a kind of weight that had nothing to do with age. It was the weight of decisions, of consequences, of years spent understanding that every choice had a price and paying that price without flinching. He scanned the room once. She knew that kind of scan. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment. She had turned back to the service station and was reaching for a water pitcher when Marcus, the maitre d', appeared at her shoulder with a level of urgency he usually reserved for fire alarms and visits from the restaurant's ownership group. "Dante Moretti," Marcus said quietly, in the tone of a man reciting something sacred and terrifying simultaneously. He called ahead. "He wants the corner table, the private one." "The private table's occupied," Evelyn said. "Reservation until 10:30. "I know. So move them." "I already comped their entire bill and gave them a gift card for their trouble." Marcus was already sweating slightly. "He wants you to handle the table personally," he specifically requested. She looked at Marcus. "He requested me." "He asked for the woman who is running the floor." Marcus said it like he wasn't sure whether that was good news or bad news, which was precisely how Evelyn felt about it. "I told him your name." She set down the water pitcher. "Fine." The corner table at Bella Rosa was positioned slightly apart from the main dining room, separated by a low architectural partition and angled toward the window. On clear nights, it had a direct view of the harbor. Tonight, it had a view of rain-hammered darkness and the distant lights of the ferry terminal smearing gold across the water. It was the most private table in the room, and it was the table the restaurant quietly kept available for guests who required discretion. Evelyn had served at that table before. She knew what it meant. She collected the menu, one menu, she noted, he hadn't mentioned guests, and crossed the room. The two security men had positioned themselves with the casual expertise of people who did this constantly. Close enough to respond, far enough to provide the illusion of privacy. She passed them without acknowledgement and stopped beside the corner table. Dante Moretti was looking out at the rain. Up close, he was more striking than the distance had suggested and also more tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes that weren't about the lighting. His hands were resting on the table, strong hands, she noticed, with the kind of minor scars across the knuckles that you didn't get from sitting behind desks. He was carrying something heavy, and he was carrying it quietly, which was the most exhausting kind of weight. She recognized it because she carried the same kind. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Evelyn. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with something from the bar?" He turned from the window and looked at her. It wasn't the look she was accustomed to in this room. The performative appreciation of men who had been raised to believe attractive service staff existed for their personal entertainment. It was direct and still and completely unreadable, the look of someone who was genuinely evaluating what they saw without any particular agenda she could identify. "Water," he said. "Whatever's open at the bar. And I'd like a few minutes." "Of course." She brought the water. She gave him 8 minutes before returning, which was 2 minutes longer than standard, because something in the way he'd been sitting suggested he needed the space. When she came back, he'd been on the phone, a brief and low conversation that ended the moment she approached, and she caught 2 words before it ended, "already handled," in a tone that suggested whatever had been handled had required some degree of force to handle. She took his order. He ordered well, the sable fish, seasonal vegetables. A specific wine she had to consult with the sommelier about because they kept only a few bottles. He didn't perform the ordering the way wealthy men often did, using the menu as a prop to demonstrate their taste and importance. He just told her what he wanted with the economy of someone who had made 10,000 decisions today and was too tired to make this one unnecessarily complicated. She appreciated that, though she would not have said so. The kitchen was still backed up. She managed his order with the priority it warranted, not because of who he was. though she was not naive enough to pretend she didn't know who he was, because in 3 years at Bellarosa you learned quickly which names carried weight in this city, but because he was her table, and her table moved on time. She managed it the same way she managed everything, by filling in every gap herself, absorbing every failure from every other quarter, and simply refusing to let the thing fall apart. His food arrived in 31 minutes. She checked the plate at the pass personally before carrying it out. The sable fish was perfect. She knew it was perfect because she'd watched the line cook plate it, and she had a reliable eye for these things despite never having had professional culinary training. She set it down. He looked at it, then at her. "You watched them make this," he said. It wasn't a question. She paused. "The kitchen was running behind tonight. I wanted to make sure the timing was right." "That your job?" "It's my table," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just enough. She left him to his dinner and went back to managing the other 14 tables she was running simultaneously. The birthday dessert that had finally arrived at table 7, late, she comped the champagne. Dennis was going to hear about this. The Barolo at table 12, the business dinner at table 4 that was wrapping up with the particular atmosphere of men who had reached an agreement they were all pretending to be satisfied with. She was clearing a side station when the dizziness hit. It wasn't the first time tonight. She'd felt it twice before. A light, swimmy feeling behind her eyes that she'd attributed to not eating because she hadn't eaten, not since the granola bar she'd consumed at 11 that morning while standing over Lily's homework before catching the bus to her afternoon prep shift. The prep shift bled into the dinner service with no real break. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours, and something inside her had been depleting steadily all evening, the way a phone depletes when you don't notice you've left every app running. She gripped the edge of the side station and breathed through it. She was good at breathing through things. The second wave came harder, and she made the mistake of looking up too fast. The room tilted. The amber light from the pendants bloomed and smeared. Her left knee buckled. The wobble in the heel, she thought distantly, absurdly. And the tray she was carrying went sideways, and she reached for the station to catch herself and missed it completely. And she didn't hit the floor. Something caught her. Specifically, someone. She became aware of several things simultaneously. That she was being held upright by arms that were considerably stronger than she'd expected. That the tray had indeed hit the floor because she could hear the distant crash of it somewhere behind her. That the dining room had gone briefly and completely silent. And that the person holding her was tall enough that her face was pressed against a shoulder that smelled like cedar and something darker underneath. Something that was just him. She pulled herself upright. Dante Moretti was standing in front of her, both hands on her arms to steady her, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read because she was still working to get her vision to stop doing the thing it was doing. "I'm fine," she said immediately, because this was her first instinct in every situation, accurate or not. "You're not," he said. "I lost my balance. The heel—" "You were about to pass out." "I wasn't." I watched it happen from across the room. His voice was level, not concerned in a theatrical way. Matter of fact, the way someone states something they observed and are not interested in debating. "When did you eat last?" The question landed harder than she expected, possibly because she had to actually stop and calculate the answer. "This morning." "This morning." He said it back flat. "And you've been running this floor for how long tonight?" She didn't answer that. "Sit down," he said. "I can't sit down. I have 14 Sit down," he said again, and there was something in the second iteration of it, not louder, not harder, but more final, that made the argument she was forming in her head feel suddenly exhausting even to herself. Marcus materialized from somewhere pale and alarmed, and 2 of the servers who'd been watching from across the room came forward to take over the tables without being asked. Evelyn let herself be guided. She told herself it was tactical, that arguing would make a bigger scene. To a chair near the service station, out of the direct sight line of the dining room. Dante crouched in front of her, which struck her as an odd thing for a man of his particular reputation to do. Getting low to be level with someone who had just nearly collapsed. He studied her face the way he'd studied the menu, with the directness of someone who wanted accurate information and wasn't interested in the performance around it. "Is there someone who can cover the floor?" he asked. "Dennis," she said, "the floor manager. He's in his—" "I know where he is." He stood. said something to one of his security men that she couldn't hear. The security man disappeared in the direction of the manager's office. Dennis emerged 90 seconds later looking like a man who had been startled out of something comfortable, straightening his jacket, his expression already composing itself into the particular shape of someone about to manage a situation they hadn't created and didn't entirely understand. He took one look at Evelyn and then one look at Dante Moretti standing in the middle of his dining room and arrived at the correct conclusion that his evening had just changed direction. "She needs food, water, and a place to sit for 15 minutes, Dante said to Dennis, in the tone of someone issuing instructions they fully expected to be followed. "And then she needs to go home." "Mr. Moretti, Can you?" Dante said. Dennis could not apparently finish that sentence. Evelyn ate. Someone brought her soup from the kitchen. Actual soup, not staff meal. The good onion soup that sold for $18 a bowl, and a glass of water and a roll from the bread basket, and she sat in the back hallway near the service station and ate it with the slightly disconnected feeling of someone operating in a situation they hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully categorize. She felt better after 5 minutes. She felt considerably better after 10. She felt something closer to herself, sharp, functional, slightly humiliated, by the time she finished the soup. She stood up and walked back toward the dining room. Dante was back at his corner table. The room had resumed its normal ambient noise. Dennis was managing the floor with significantly more visible effort than he usually applied. She approached the corner table. "Your check," she said, setting it down. He looked at it, looked at her. "How long have you been running this floor by yourself?" "That's not—" "How long?" 4 hours. A pause. "Maybe 5. While managing 14 tables." 15. Table 11 came in at 8. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You were going to keep going." "I was going to finish my shift." "Until you hit the floor." She didn't have an answer for that, because it was true, and she knew it was true, and the fact that it was true bothered her more than she wanted to show. "I don't have the option of not finishing my shift," she said, and she hadn't meant it to come out the way it came out, raw, direct, with the tired honesty of someone who has spent too long performing fine. But she was depleted enough that the usual filters weren't working at full capacity. He looked at her for a long moment. "What's your full name?" he said. "Evelyn Cross." He wrote something on the inside of the check folder, not on the receipt, on the folder itself, and stood. He was taller than she'd clocked initially. She had to make a small adjustment in how she was holding herself to maintain eye contact without tilting her head back, which she refused to do. "Thank you for dinner," he said. It was said simply, without the performed graciousness that wealthy men in this restaurant usually deployed. He said it like he meant it, which was its own kind of disorienting. He left. She opened the check folder. He had left 23% on an already substantial bill, which was reasonable without being ostentatious. But that wasn't what stopped her breathing for a moment. On the inside cover, in handwriting that was clean and spare, he had written a phone number and beneath it, 4 words. "Call if you need." She stared at it for longer than she should have. Then she closed the folder, slipped the receipt through for processing, and went back to work. She didn't call. She thought about it twice on the bus ride home. The crosstown 44, half empty at this hour, rain still hammering the windows. And both times she talked herself out of thinking about it by reminding herself of exactly the kind of man Dante Moretti was. She had lived in Seattle long enough and worked at Bella Rosa long enough to know the name. Not the details. The details were the kind of thing that stayed in quiet rooms and never reached newspapers, but the weight of it, the way Marcus had said it, the way the 2 security men moved, the way the room had shifted when he walked in, not from celebrity, but from something more animal than that. She had enough complication in her life. She unlocked the apartment door at midnight. The apartment was a 2-bedroom in the Central District, 3rd floor of a building that was perpetually promising renovations and perpetually not delivering them. The hallway smelled like the neighbor's cooking, something heavy with garlic and cumin, and the elevator had been broken since February. Lily was asleep on the couch with her laptop open and a textbook splayed across her chest. She was 23 now. Not a kid anymore, though Evelyn sometimes forgot this. A junior at UW studying architecture, carrying a partial scholarship, and a course load that should have been impossible and somehow wasn't because Lily had inherited their mother's stubborn brilliance without inheriting anything else about her. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at her sister sleeping. The laptop screen was still on, open to a structural engineering problem set. Lily had dark circles under her eyes that matched Evelyn's own. She picked up the textbook carefully, set it on the table, and turned off the lamp. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her shoes. Her left heel came apart in her hand. The sole had cracked through completely, finally, the way things finally give after you've asked too much of them for too long. She set it on the floor and looked at it. She had $47 in her checking account until Friday. The heel replacement would cost $25 minimum. Lily had a course materials fee due next week, $110 she hadn't mentioned yet, but Evelyn had seen the email because Lily still used her older email address for college correspondence, the one Evelyn had helped her set up when she was 16. She did the math. She always did the math. She lay back on the bed without changing clothes and stared at the ceiling. The phone number was written on the inside of a check folder she'd left at the restaurant. She hadn't taken it with her. She told herself this was because she didn't need it, which was true in every way she was willing to examine. She fell asleep with her uniform still on and the broken heel sitting on the floor beside the bed like evidence of something she hadn't finished dealing with yet. She didn't dream. The morning came at 7:15 when Lily knocked on the door to ask if they had coffee. They were out of coffee, and Evelyn sat up with the particular full-body stiffness of someone who'd slept wrong on top of 9 hours of physical labor. She told Lily there was instant in the back of the second cabinet. Lily made a face that Evelyn didn't see but could perfectly describe from memory. She showered. She pressed a clean uniform. She ate half a banana and drank the instant coffee standing over the sink, watching the rain, still raining, this city, relentless, streak down the kitchen window. She was out the door by 8:15. She got to Bella Rosa at 9 for the opening prep. The lunch service started at 11:30, and she had inventory to check and a staff schedule to review because 2 of the servers had requested the same Saturday off, and someone had apparently approved both requests without checking, which was the kind of thing that happened when Dennis was involved in decisions. She was in the back office working through the schedule when Marcus appeared in the doorway. His expression was the same one from last night. The calibrated alarm, the careful withholding of information until he figured out how to frame it. "There was a call this morning," he said. "Before you got in." She kept her eyes on the schedule. "From who?" "From Mr. Moretti's office." A pause. "His personal assistant." She looked up. "He's purchasing the restaurant," Marcus said. "Bella Rosa. He's been in acquisition talks with the ownership group for 3 months apparently. The deal closed this morning." She put down her pen. "The assistant called to inform the management staff and to pass along Mr. Moretti's specific instruction regarding staffing." Marcus was very carefully not looking directly at her when he said the next part. "He's retaining all existing staff, but he's restructuring management. Dennis has been... There's a severance package. He's out." "Okay," she said slowly. "And he's named a new general manager." Marcus looked at her now. "Effective immediately." The silence in the office was very complete. "He doesn't know me," she said. "He apparently feels he knows enough. Marcus, I'm a floor manager with no... But the title is general manager. The salary is..." Marcus named a number that made her stop breathing for a second. "Plus full benefits, restaurant account, and apparently Mr. Moretti intends to be a relatively hands-off owner in terms of day-to-day operations." He said... Marcus glanced at something on his phone, reading it. He said, "She already knows how to run it. She just needs the authority and the resources to do it right." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, crossed to the window, and stood looking out at the alley behind the restaurant where the delivery trucks came, and where she'd eaten more than one shift meal standing against the brick wall because there was nowhere else to sit. "Something doesn't add up," she said. "No," Marcus agreed, with the calm of a man who had already done this calculation and arrived at the same conclusion. "It doesn't. He comes in for one dinner and decides to offer me a position like this. He apparently watched you run a 15-table floor alone for 5 hours while running on empty, catch an emergency, and still check the quality of his plate personally before delivering it." Marcus paused. "I don't know what else he saw, but I think that might have been enough. Or it's something else entirely." Also possible. She turned back from the window. What do you know about him? Really know, not what people say. Marcus was quiet for a moment, which told her more than a direct answer would have. I know that Belarus has been quietly struggling. The ownership group has been underwater since last winter. The kitchen renos they promised the staff haven't happened. The equipment's failing. He folded his hands. I know that whoever owns this restaurant going forward has significant resources and apparently specific intentions for what they want it to become. And I'm supposed to just... You're supposed to decide, Marcus said. His assistant said he'd expect an answer by end of day. She didn't say anything for the rest of the morning. She ran the prep. She managed the lunch service, which was lighter than usual. A Thursday, tourist season still 2 months out. She did the inventory she'd planned to do and fixed the scheduling conflict and ate an actual meal during the service gap. A proper one, sitting down at the staff table, because last night had clarified something about the limits of what she could ask of her own body. At 3 o'clock, she stepped outside to the alley with her phone. She didn't have the number. She'd left the check folder. She called the main restaurant line from memory, got the reservation desk, asked to be connected to whatever number Mr. Moretti's office had called from this morning. The assistant who answered was professional and brisk and gave nothing away. She asked to speak with Mr. Moretti directly and was told he was unavailable, but that he'd been expecting her call, which was its own kind of statement. Tell him I accept, she said. But I have conditions. There was a brief pause. I'll pass that along. I want full operational authority. Staffing, menu, suppliers, all of it. I won't run a floor where someone else is second-guessing every decision in real time. Another pause, longer. I'll relay that. And I want the kitchen renovation completed within 90 days. Not promised. Completed. She could hear faintly the assistant writing. Anything else? The assistant asked. Evelyn leaned against the brick wall. The rain had eased to a thin mist. Down the alley, a delivery truck was idling, and someone was arguing about the wrong order. That's enough for now, she said. She hung up. She went back inside. She didn't hear back that afternoon. She ran the light dinner prep, handed off to the evening crew, and caught the bus home at 6. She was heating soup, actual soup, from a can, the budget kind with the peel-back lid, when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. Ms. Cross? The voice was the one from last night, quiet, level, carrying that same particular weight. I'm told you have conditions. She sat down at the kitchen table. I do. Tell me. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual in her experience of people with authority. They usually interrupted to demonstrate they'd already considered what you were saying and found it acceptable or not acceptable, whichever served them more efficiently. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for 2 seconds. Agreed, he said. All of it. All of it. A pause. The renovation will take 110 days to do correctly. I won't cut corners on the kitchen. Fine. Another pause. You're not going to ask why. Why what? Why I'm doing this. She looked at the soup cooling on the stove. I'm going to ask it eventually, she said. I just don't think tonight is when you're going to tell me the truth about it. The silence that followed was long enough that she almost said something to fill it. She didn't. Monday morning, he said, 9 o'clock. I'll be at the restaurant. I'll be there. He ended the call. Lily came out of her room, drawn by the smell of soup, and stopped when she saw Evelyn's expression. What happened? Evelyn looked at her sister. 23 years old, architecture textbooks, a scholarship she was killing herself to keep, course fees she hadn't mentioned because she knew better than to add to the pile. Something changed, Evelyn said. She got up and poured the soup into a bowl. Something changed, and I don't know what it means yet. Good changed or bad changed? She thought about the phone number on the inside of the check folder. She thought about the way he'd crouched in front of her when she'd nearly fallen, getting level with her, which was not the behavior of a man who was used to looking down at people even though he clearly could. She thought about she already knows how to run it. She just needs the authority and the resources to do it right. She thought about the name Dante Moretti and everything that name carried in this city. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Eat your soup. That night she lay awake for an hour, which was unusual. She was generally asleep within minutes of her head hitting the pillow because her body had nothing left to run on by the end of any given day. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Monday morning. She thought about the kind of man who closed a restaurant acquisition and restructured the management in the same 24-hour window that he'd first set foot inside the place. The kind of efficiency that required wasn't just resources, it was clarity of purpose, an already made decision waiting for confirmation. He'd been watching Bellarosa long before last night, which meant the question wasn't what she'd done to earn this. The question was what she'd confirmed, and she didn't know the answer to that yet, which meant Monday morning wasn't just the beginning of a new job. It was the beginning of understanding exactly what she had walked into, and whether the door behind her was still open or whether it had already, quietly, closed. Monday came in cold and clear, which was unusual for Seattle in early April, the kind of morning that felt like the city was holding its breath. The light off the harbor was flat and silver, and the streets near the waterfront were still wet from the weekend rain, even though the rain itself had stopped sometime before dawn. Evelyn arrived at Bellarosa at 8:40. She told him 9. She came 20 minutes early because she always came 20 minutes early, because being early was how you controlled the variables before someone else did. She had her notebook. She had a printed copy of the last 6 months of inventory records she'd pulled from the back office system before the handover. The supplier contract she'd located in the filing cabinet Dennis had apparently used primarily as a storage space for old takeout menus and golf magazines, and a list of 12 items she'd identified as immediate operational issues that needed addressing in the first 30 days. She stood at the host stand and looked at the room. In the morning light, before the service staff arrived and before the kitchen crew filled it with noise and heat and the smell of prep work, Bellarosa looked exactly like what it was. A beautiful space with a serious infrastructure problem. The exposed brick was original and good. The pendant lighting was well chosen. But the ceiling near the kitchen pass had a water stain she'd been watching spread for 2 months. 2 of the banquette cushions on the east wall were worn through at the corners. The bar top had a hairline crack running 18 inches along the grain that had been filled and refinished so many times, the filler was starting to lift. The kitchen, she knew, was worse. She'd worked around it long enough to know exactly how much the line crew compensated daily for equipment that was past its service life. The convection oven with the uneven heating they'd learned to rotate around, the refrigeration unit that ran 3 degrees warmer than its display indicated, the ventilation that was supposed to run at a certain capacity and clearly wasn't. She made notes. She was always making notes. The front door opened at 9:02. Dante came in with 1 man instead of 2, which she noted. The same security she'd seen Friday, the taller of the 2, with a watchful quality she'd clocked as more intelligence gathering than muscle, but only 1. Either this was deliberate reduction, suggesting he considered this a lower threat environment than a public dinner service, or it was a signal about the register of the meeting. She wasn't sure which, and she filed the uncertainty. He looked different in the morning, not softer. That wasn't the word. Less composed, maybe. In the specific way that early hours eroded the performance people built around themselves. He'd slept, she could tell, but not well, or not enough. There was a tension in the set of his jaw that hadn't been there Friday, or had been there and she hadn't been looking for it. He looked at her, then at the notebook and the papers spread across the host stand. "You've been here a while," he said. 20 minutes, she said. "There's a lot to cover." He looked at the papers. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite approval, not quite something else, just a recalibration. "Let's sit." They took the corner table. His, apparently, by default. The security man positioned himself near the bar, out of earshot, and picked up his phone with the practiced casualness of someone performing disinterest. Evelyn laid out her 12 items. She took him through them without preamble. The water stain, the equipment failures, the supplier contracts that had 2-week notification clauses she wanted to exercise on 3 of them because she'd already identified better terms elsewhere. The staffing problem, 2 senior servers she wanted to retain and 1 she wanted to let go, a line cook she'd been watching for 6 months who deserved a promotion the previous ownership had slow-walked for reasons she suspected were financial. The kitchen renovation timeline she wanted to discuss in specific phases rather than as a single project because doing it all at once would require closing the restaurant for a period that would cost more than the renovation itself in lost revenue. He listened the way he'd listened on the phone. No interruptions, no performance of listening, just the real thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The line cook," he said. "Promotion to what?" "Sous chef. The current sous chef is coasting, and the crew knows it. It's affecting morale." "You'd let the current sous chef go, with appropriate notice and severance. He's not a bad cook, he's just stopped caring. That happens." She looked at him directly. "I'd rather manage it cleanly than let it drag. The supplier contracts, the 3 you want to renegotiate. What are the new terms?" She showed him. He looked at the numbers, looked at her. "You found these over the weekend," he said. "I found 2 of them months ago. I didn't have the authority to act on them." He leaned back slightly. "You do now. I know. That's why I'm telling you, not asking." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Just the kind of pause that happens when 2 people are recalibrating their read on each other in real time. "The kitchen renovation," he said. "Walk me through the phases." She did. He asked good questions. Specific, resource-focused, not the questions of someone performing due diligence, but the questions of someone who actually understood operational logistics. She found herself slightly surprised by this and made a conscious effort not to show it, because showing it would tell him more about her assumptions than she wanted to volunteer. By 10:30, they had covered everything on her list. She closed her notebook. "Now I want to know something." "Go ahead." "Why Bellarosa? You have, I don't know the full scope of your holdings, but you have enough that this one restaurant is not a significant financial investment. The acquisition alone probably costs more in legal fees than this place earns in a quarter." She watched him. "So what's the actual reason?" He was quiet. "I told you Friday night I'd ask eventually," she said. "And I told you I didn't think you'd be ready to tell me the truth about it yet." She held his gaze. "Is today different?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on the street, and the light shifted slightly as a cloud moved across the harbor. "I've been watching this block for 2 years," he said finally. "The location, the foot traffic patterns, the demographic data. The waterfront's changing. The development north of here is going to pull significant disposable income into this corridor within 18 months. Bellarosa's positioned perfectly for it." "That's the business reason," she said. "That's one reason." "What's the other one?" He looked at the table for a second. When he looked back up, his expression was still controlled, but underneath it, something had shifted that she couldn't fully name. "The other reasons are less straightforward. Most real reasons are." He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there. "You're very direct, Ms. Cross. I can't run something effectively if I don't understand the parameters. And you need to understand the parameters before you feel safe proceeding." "I need to understand the parameters before I feel informed enough to do my job well," she said, which was a correction that was also a statement of something more personal than job performance. And she knew he heard it that way because of the slight stillness that came into his face. "You'll have full operational authority," he said. "What happens inside this restaurant is yours. I won't interfere with that." "I understand that. That's not what I'm asking about." He was quiet again. Then, "There are things connected to my name that are complicated. You're not unaware of that?" "No." "And you took the job anyway." "I took the job for my own reasons," she said. "Which doesn't mean I'm not keeping my eyes open." Something moved through his expression at that. Something that might have been respect or might have been a reassessment, and she still couldn't read him well enough to know which. "I'll be in Seattle for the next several weeks," he said. "During the renovation planning, I'll want regular updates. That means some overlap in our schedules." He paused. "I'm telling you that in advance rather than having it develop without warning." "I appreciate that." "I'm not sure you do yet," he said. "But I think you will." She drove home that night. She'd taken the bus to work, but Marcus had offered her the use of the restaurant's reserved parking for the duration of her tenure, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing at all, with the conversation running on a quiet loop in her head. Not the operational items, those she'd already sorted and filed and begun acting on mentally. The other parts, the pauses, the things that had been said slightly sideways of their actual meaning. She had learned in years of managing difficult rooms to read people. It was a survival skill more than a professional one, knowing when a table was about to turn ugly, when a conflict in the kitchen was 2 exchanges away from becoming physical, when someone was telling you one thing and meaning another. She read people the way other people read weather, from small shifts in pressure and temperature that most people didn't bother to notice. She had read Dante Moretti twice now, and she still didn't have a clean take on him, which was, itself, Information. The first week was operational combat, and she loved it. She fired the supplier contracts on day 2, negotiated the replacements by day 4, and had the new agreement signed by the following Monday. She promoted the line cook. His name was Rafael, 28, from Guadalajara, with hands that moved like he'd been born in a professional kitchen, and managed the previous sous chef's departure with the clean efficiency she'd promised. She addressed the banquette cushions, ordered materials for the water stain repair, and began the preliminary consultations for the kitchen renovation with a contractor whose name Dante's office had provided and who turned out to be extraordinarily competent and refreshingly honest about timelines. The staff watched her. That was normal. New management always generated watchfulness, a kind of collective holding of breath, while people assessed whether things were going to get better or worse. She had learned that the fastest way to resolve that tension was to demonstrate clearly and consistently that she was going to do what she said she was going to do. She did that. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed in the subtle but unmistakable way that atmospheres change when the people in them start to believe their environment is functional. Raphael was putting out food that made her stop at the pass and actually look at it. The front-of-house crew was running cleaner. The revenue surprised her. She reviewed the numbers with Marcus on a Thursday evening, the restaurant empty around them, receipts spread across the bar. "This can't be right," she said. "It's right," Marcus said. "We're up 18% on covers compared to the same period last year. Word's getting out that something changed." He paused. "People are curious about the new ownership, too." She set down the spreadsheet. "How public is the ownership change?" "It's public record. The filing went through last week." Marcus looked at her carefully. "There was a piece in the Seattle Business Journal. Dante Moretti acquires Elliott Bay Landmark. Brief. They listed you as the new GM." She hadn't known about the journal piece. She kept her expression neutral while internally filing the information next to everything else she'd been accumulating about the gap between what she was being told and what was actually happening around her. Dante came in on the Thursday of the third week for what he'd described as a routine check-in. He arrived at 7. The dinner service was running, which she hadn't expected, and she found herself briefly wrong-footed, which she disliked. And he sat at the corner table and ate dinner alone, and then found her at the end of the service, and they talked for 40 minutes about the renovation plans, and then about other things, less structured things, the kind of conversation that happens when two people have exhausted the professional agenda and neither of them immediately exits. She didn't notice when the conversation stopped being about the restaurant. She noticed afterward, on the drive home. The moment she was out of his orbit, she could see the shape of the last 40 minutes more clearly, and what she saw was a conversation that had moved, by increments so small they were almost undetectable, from operational logistics to, she didn't have a clean word for it, something more personal, something that wasn't about Bellarosa at all. She sat in the parking garage of her building with the engine off for 3 minutes, just thinking. She thought about the way he'd asked about Lily. Not intrusively, she'd mentioned her sister in passing, and he'd followed it up with the focused attention he brought to everything, so that answering felt natural, felt like offering information rather than having it extracted. She told him Lily was in architecture at UW, that she was extraordinary, that she'd gotten herself there on a partial scholarship and her own ferocious intelligence, and he'd listened with a quality of attention that made her feel, and this was the part she turned over in the parking garage, seen. Not assessed, not evaluated for usefulness, just seen. She went upstairs and didn't mention it to Lily. The call came on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after that. She was in the back office reviewing the renovation budget when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was mid-calculation, and she had a rule about unknown numbers during work hours. She answered it. "Is this Evelyn Cross?" The voice was male, and the phrasing was flat in a particular way. The way statements become questions when the speaker already knows the answer and the question is purely performative. "Who's calling?" "A friend," the voice said. "More specifically, a friend who's interested in your recent professional development, the promotion, the new ownership. All of it." She set down her pen. "I don't know who you are." "You know the name Dante Moretti?" Not a question. "And I'm guessing by now you know enough about who he is that you've had some questions of your own about what exactly you've stepped into." The cold that moved through her was not panic. She'd been carrying a low-level version of this specific apprehension, Since the morning Marcus had said Dante Moretti at the host stand, and she'd heard the weight in it. This was just the apprehension finding its shape. "What do you want?" she said. "Information," the voice said. "About the renovation, the suppliers, who he's meeting with, when. Routine business information. Nothing dramatic. You want me to spy on the man who employs me. I want you to have a conversation, a business-like one." A pause. "In exchange, I can make certain complications in your life considerably simpler. I understand your sister is at UW, expensive situation for someone on a waitress salary, even a newly promoted one." She was very still. "You've got the wrong read on me," she said. "I don't think so. I'm going to end this call and I'm going to report it." She kept her voice level. "Don't call this number again." She ended the call. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for 30 seconds. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was elevated in a controlled way. Not fear exactly, but the body's acknowledgement that the situation had just changed in a direction that mattered. She called Dante's assistant. She got the assistant directly and asked to speak with Dante and was told he was in a meeting but could be reached in approximately an hour. She said she'd wait. He called back in 45 minutes. She told him about the call. She told him the words verbatim because she'd been repeating them in her head since the moment the call ended, holding them exactly as they'd arrived so she could report them accurately. She told him what they'd wanted. She told him what she'd said. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than she'd come to expect from him. He was usually fast, not impulsive, but quick, his processing happening at a speed that meant his silences were short. This silence was not short. "Where are you right now?" he said. "Back office at the restaurant." "Stay there." His voice had changed. The controlled quality was still there, but something beneath it had tightened. "Don't go anywhere until I call you back." "Dante." 30 minutes, he said. "Don't leave the building." He hung up. She put her phone on the desk and looked at the renovation budget still open on her screen. The numbers blurred slightly. She blinked them back into focus. 32 minutes later, one of the security men she recognized from that first night walked through the restaurant door and found her in the back office. He didn't explain anything. He asked her to come with him. His tone was professional and entirely without warmth, and she understood that this was not a request in any meaningful sense. She came with him. He drove her in a black SUV that was parked illegally in the loading zone outside and that nobody had apparently ticketed. Not to a location she recognized, but to a building in Soldado, a converted warehouse near the rail yards that had no visible signage and a security setup at the entrance, she noted with the careful attention she was devoting to everything in her immediate environment. Dante was inside. There were 3 other men she didn't know. She cataloged them quickly. Late 30s to mid-40s, none of them soft, all of them carrying the same alert stillness as his security. A table with laptops, a wall-mounted screen showing what looked like surveillance footage. He crossed to her immediately when she came in, which surprised her. She had expected to be managed to a waiting area while the actual conversation happened somewhere she wasn't. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine." She held his gaze. "Tell me what's happening." His jaw tightened fractionally. He looked at one of the other men, a gesture, slight. And the other men moved to the far side of the room with the coordinated ease of people who were used to this. "The man who called you," Dante said. "His name is Victor Salazar." She'd never heard the name. She said so. "He runs a network in this city that has been intersecting with my operations for the last 3 years. Dante's voice was flat and precise. "He's been looking for leverage, something to use." He paused. "He found you. He found a restaurant manager. He found the person I promoted the morning after meeting her." His eyes stayed on her face. In his read, that's not a routine hire. She understood what he was saying. She didn't say it back. "He's been watching you since the Business Journal piece ran," Dante said. "Your apartment building, your sister's campus schedule." The cold came back, sharper this time. "Lily. She's not in immediate danger, but Salazar doesn't do things by accident. The call today was a test. He wanted to see how you'd respond, whether you'd tell me, how fast." Dante looked at her steadily. "You passed his test, which means he's now moving to the next phase." "What's the next phase?" Dante didn't answer immediately. "What's the next phase?" she said again, and this time there was an edge in it. "We don't know yet," he said. which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. I've been honest with you. I know. He held her gaze. Do you want out? If you want to walk away from Bellarosa, from all of this, right now, tonight, I can arrange it. New position somewhere else. Relocation assistance, no trace back to me or to this. He paused. It won't be easy, but it's possible. She stood in the converted warehouse with the surveillance feeds running on the wall behind him, and the weight of everything she'd walked into pressing against her sternum. And she thought about the broken heel on her bedroom floor, and the $47 in her checking account, and Lily's textbook spread across the couch, and the granola bar she'd eaten at 11 a.m. on a Friday, and called it enough. She thought about the soup, the phone number. She already knows how to run it. She just needs the authority and the resources to do it right. She thought about the way he'd crouched in front of her. No, she said. He was very still. You understand what staying means. I understand that leaving doesn't make Victor Salazar stop existing, she said. And I understand that running is only a solution if the thing chasing you has a limited range. She looked at him. Does he? Dante's jaw worked. No. Then I stay, she said. And you tell me everything I need to know to navigate this correctly. She held his gaze. All of it. Not the version you think I can handle, the actual version. Outside, the rail yards were quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a train moved, slow and heavy, the sound of it traveling through the ground before it reached the air. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the table and opened one of the laptops. And on the screen, she saw a surveillance photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, through a lens that had been working at the edge of its range. It was her apartment building, the front entrance, time-stamped 48 hours ago. And standing across the street, watching the door, was a man she had never seen before in her life. She looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Dante. How long has he been watching my building? She said. Since the day after the journal piece, Dante said. 4 days. 4 days. She had walked in and out of that building 4 days running, past that street corner, completely unaware that someone was there cataloging her movements, her schedule, the times she came and went, whether she was alone, whether Lily was with her, what the patterns were that could be exploited when the time came to. She stared at the photograph for a long time after Dante stopped talking. 4 days. The number sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She had walked past that corner 4 days running. Tuesday morning, when she'd left early for the supplier meeting. Wednesday evening, when she'd stayed late and taken the bus home because she'd forgotten she had the car. Thursday, when Lily had met her for lunch, and they'd walked together from the restaurant to the campus shuttle stop 2 blocks north. Lily had been on that street. You knew, Evelyn said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her because nothing else inside her was level at the moment. You knew he was watching my building and you didn't tell me. Dante didn't look away. We confirmed it 40 hours ago. I was building the full picture before what? She turned to face him completely. Before you decided I had enough information to make decisions about my own life? Before I had something actionable to tell you instead of just frightening you? That wasn't your call to make. No, he said. It wasn't. You're right. She hadn't expected him to concede that immediately, and the immediacy of it took some of the fuel out of the anger, which frustrated her because she needed the anger right now. It was keeping everything else, the cold, the fear, the image of Lily walking obliviously past a man who was cataloging her patterns, at a manageable distance. She turned back to the laptop screen. The photograph was still open. The man in it was unremarkable in the specific way that made him remarkable. Forgettable face, neutral clothing, the practiced stillness of someone who had done this before and knew how to disappear into urban background noise. Who is he? She said. One of Salazar's people, mid-level, surveillance, not enforcement. Dante said it with the careful distinction of someone who understood the difference mattered. He's been rotated out since yesterday. We made sure of that. You made sure. My people identified him. He's been managed. She looked at Dante. Managed means what, exactly? It means he's no longer watching your building, Dante said. And it means Salazar knows that we know. He paused, which changes the timeline. What timeline? He moved to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. Not at the head of the table. He pulled a chair from the side, the kind of positioning that put him level rather than above, and she noticed it the way she'd noticed him crouching in front of her the night she'd nearly collapsed. She filed it. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He told her. Not the managed version. She'd asked for the real one, and he gave it to her, which she would think about later. The fact that he actually had. Victor Salazar had been operating in Seattle's gray infrastructure for 11 years. Import logistics, labor contracting, a layer of legitimate business over a network that Dante described with the careful precision of someone who had been studying it for a long time. The conflict between them was 3 years old, rooted in territory that wasn't geographic so much as financial, supply chains, port access, the kind of institutional arrangements that generated money without generating headlines. Dante had spent those 3 years methodically legitimizing his own holdings. Not from a position of moral transformation, he was direct about that, which she appreciated, but from a strategic one. Legitimate operations were harder to attack, harder to leverage, harder to destabilize through the kind of pressure Salazar preferred. It was working. And Salazar knew it was working, which was why he was looking for something personal. He spent the last 18 months trying to find something I care about enough to protect irrationally, Dante said. Something that bypasses strategy. She understood what he was saying. She said nothing. The business journal piece was bad timing, he said. The acquisition was always going to be public record, but the piece ran the way it ran. My name, your name, the framing of the promotion. It gave him something to look at, and I looked like something you cared about irrationally, she said. You looked like someone I made an unusual decision about. He held her gaze, which isn't entirely wrong. The warehouse was quiet around them. The 3 men at the far end of the room were doing something at the laptops. She could hear the low sound of keys, the occasional murmur, but they were maintaining the distance Dante had gestured them into and not looking over. What happens now? She said. I'd like to move you, he said. You and Lily. There's a property on the north end of the waterfront. It's off public record, registered to a holding company. Secure, private. It would be temporary until we resolve the Salazar situation. Resolve, she said. Yes. What does resolve mean? He was quiet for a moment. It means the situation ends in a way that removes the threat permanently. She thought about that. How long? Weeks, maybe a month. She looked at the table. Lily had a midterm in 11 days. She had a study group she met on Tuesday evenings in the campus library. She had a boyfriend named James, who Evelyn had met twice and found aggressively ordinary in the way that suggested stability, which was the best thing she could say about him, and whose apartment Lily sometimes stayed at on weekends. My sister's life can't stop, Evelyn said. I know. She has school, she has... I know. He leaned forward slightly. We can work around her schedule, security that's invisible. She doesn't need to know the details if you'd rather she didn't. I'll have someone on the campus, someone on James Whitfield. The fact that he already knew James's last name landed quietly and with some weight. You've been building this picture for a while, she said, since the journal piece. That was 3 weeks ago. Yes, she sat with that. 3 weeks of him knowing something was moving toward her, building the information architecture around it, and saying nothing to her while she ran her restaurant and negotiated supplier contracts and promoted Raphael and slept in her apartment 4 days' walk from a man on a corner who was watching the door. I need you to understand something, she said. I can handle information. I've been handling difficult information my entire adult life without anyone's help. What I cannot handle is being managed without my consent. She kept her voice even. If something is happening that affects me or Lily, I need to know, even if you don't have the full picture yet, even if it's going to frighten me, because I do better with the truth than with the version of events people decide I'm ready for. He looked at her for a long moment. That's fair, he said. I won't do it again. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure she should believe him, but she did. When do you need an answer about the property? She said. Tonight would be better than tomorrow. She called Lily from the hallway outside the main room. Lily answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular distracted quality of someone interrupted mid-concentration. Are you on campus? Evelyn said. Library. Why, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I need you to go to James's tonight and stay there. A pause. Evie, Lily, she kept her voice calm. I'll explain everything later. I promise I will. But tonight I need you to not be at the apartment. Lily was quiet for 3 seconds. She and Evelyn had lived in close enough orbit for long enough that Lily had developed a calibrated ear for when her sister's controlled tone was covering something real. How serious? I don't know yet. Serious enough. Another pause. Okay, Lily said. She didn't ask more questions, which was an act of trust that cost Evelyn something to receive. Call me. I will. They moved to the waterfront property that same night. It was not what she'd imagined when Dante had said property. She'd pictured something austere, functional, the architectural language of security over comfort. What she found instead was a low, sprawling house set back from the water behind a natural tree line, with large windows that looked south toward the harbor, and an interior that was spare but considered, not staged. Inhabited, at some point, by someone who'd made real choices about what they wanted around them. She didn't ask whose it was. She took the room on the east side. Lily arrived an hour later with a backpack and her laptop, and the particular set of Lily's jaw that meant she was frightened and had decided to be practical about it, which was the most Evelyn of things she did. Evelyn told her enough. Not everything. There were pieces she was still assembling herself, but enough that Lily could understand the shape of it. There was a man named Salazar. He had an interest in using Evelyn to get to Dante. Until that situation was resolved, they were going to be somewhere safer than the apartment. Lily listened. She asked 3 questions, all practical. She set up her laptop at the kitchen table and went back to her problem set. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her sister work and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Something between relief and grief, the specific ache of having kept someone safe through a crisis they only partially understood. The next 3 days were strange. Strange because the waterfront house had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. Strange because Dante was there. He's not constantly. He had his own room and his own schedule, and he was in and out with the regularity of someone managing multiple operational demands simultaneously, but present enough that she began to build a picture of him that was different from the one she'd assembled across a restaurant table. He woke early. She knew this because she also woke early, and the kitchen light was always already on when she came downstairs. He drank black coffee and read from a tablet, physical newspapers sometimes, and he didn't attempt conversation at 6 in the morning, which she found she appreciated enormously. He had a quality of self-containment that wasn't coldness. It was more like he had learned at some point not to require things from the people around him, and had settled into that self-sufficiency without resentment. She found it familiar in a way that unsettled her slightly. She ran Bella Rosa remotely. Marcus managed the floor and sent her daily briefings. Raphael was performing exactly the way she'd known he would. The renovation was on schedule. Revenue was up again, 22% over comparable period, which she reviewed in the kitchen of the waterfront house on the second morning while Dante read across the table and the harbor light came in low and gray through the windows, and Lily's architecture textbooks were stacked by the door. On the third day, everything broke. She was in the small office off the main hallway, a room with a desk and a landline and a printer, the functional room, the one that didn't have the careful aesthetic of the rest of the house, working through the kitchen renovation budget when Marcus called. He didn't call her direct line. He called the restaurant's general number and asked for her specifically, which meant he was at the restaurant, which meant he was either managing something he didn't want to handle over text, or something had happened that he wanted to tell her in real time. "Talk to me," she said. "There's someone here." His voice was careful. The careful voice he'd used the morning he told her about Dante's acquisition, the voice of information being measured before delivery. "He came in 20 minutes ago, said he's a supplier, Hartwell Foods, the produce account. But Evelyn, we dropped Hartwell 3 weeks ago. We switched to Cascadia." She was still. "What does he want?" "He asked to speak to you specifically. He said—" Marcus dropped his voice. "He said he has information you're going to want before it reaches someone else." She looked at the wall. "What's his name?" He gave a name, Callahan. A pause. "But Evelyn, I've dealt with every rep from Hartwell for the last 2 years. I've never seen this man before in my life." She told Marcus to put him in the private dining room and tell him she was on her way. She went to find Dante. He was in the main room with 2 of his people. Something on the wall screen she didn't fully register because her attention was on him. She told him what Marcus had said. He listened without moving. When she finished, he looked at one of his men. She'd learned his name was Cole, the tall one, the intelligence gatherer, and something passed between them that she didn't have the vocabulary to read but understood to be significant. "Don't go," Dante said. "He's in my restaurant asking for me personally, which is exactly why you shouldn't go. If I don't go, he leaves, and we don't find out what he was going to tell me." She looked at Dante directly. "You said you'd stop managing my information." His jaw tightened. "This is different." "How?" "Because Salazar doesn't send someone to your restaurant with a message unless the message is the least important part of what's happening." He was on his feet now, and she registered that the room had shifted. Cole was already moving. The second man's hands had come off the table. "It's a draw. He wants you in a specific location at a specific time." "For what purpose?" Dante looked at her, and she read something in his expression she hadn't seen there before. Not quite fear, not quite that, but something in the same family. "I don't know," he said, and the fact that he said "I don't know" instead of something reassuring told her more than a direct answer would have. She didn't go to the restaurant. Cole went instead with one of the other men in an unmarked car. Marcus had been told, via a call Dante made, to stall the man in the private dining room on the pretext of waiting for Evelyn to arrive. He was cooperative. Marcus was extraordinarily good at stalling. What Cole found, or rather, what Cole called back to report 30 minutes later, was not what any of them had been expecting. The man was gone. He'd left the private dining room at some point during the wait. The restaurant's exterior cameras had caught him exiting via the back alley. The loading zone, the delivery entrance, the door Evelyn had leaned against on 100 lunch breaks. And in the footage he was on a phone, and the call appeared brief, and then he was gone around the corner and out of frame. But that wasn't what Cole was calling about. Cole was calling because Marcus, checking the private dining room after the man left, had found something on the table. Not a business card, not a note, a photograph. "What photograph?" Dante said. He was standing in the middle of the waterfront house main room, phone to his ear, his voice doing the thing it did under pressure. Getting quieter, flatter, more precise. Cole said something. Evelyn couldn't hear it from where she was standing, but she watched Dante's face, and she saw the exact moment the information arrived and what it did to him. He lowered the phone. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. "It's a photograph of this property." The cold came back all at once, absolute. "This property," she said, "the one that's not on public record." "Yes." "He knows where we are." "Yes." She stood very still. Behind her, from the kitchen, she could hear the quiet sound of Lily typing. The rhythm of it, steady and oblivious and unbearably ordinary. "There's something else," Dante said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard it go before. Something scraped back to the bone, without any of the controlled weight it usually carried. "What?" He handed her the phone. On the screen was a photograph. She understood it to be a picture of the photograph Cole had found on the table at Bella Rosa, taken on Cole's phone and sent to Dante. The original photograph had been taken from a distance, through a zoom lens, angled down from an elevation that suggested a building across the water or north along the tree line. It showed the waterfront house, the kitchen window specifically, and visible through the kitchen window, lit from within, sitting at the table with her laptop open and her architecture textbook stacked at her elbow. Lily. The photograph had a timestamp in the lower right corner. It had been taken 11 hours ago. In the middle of the night, while they slept, while the security team presumably ran its perimeter checks, while everything was supposed to be controlled and contained and safe, someone had been out there in the dark with a lens pointed at the kitchen window, and they had taken a photograph of her sister. Evelyn set the phone down on the table. She did it carefully, deliberately, the way she set things down when she needed her hands to be empty. She was aware of her own breathing, steady, controlled, the breath of someone who had not yet decided what to do with the thing burning in her chest. "How?" she said. Dante's expression was stripped of everything except the weight of it. "I don't know yet." "How did they find this property?" "I don't know." "You said it was off public record. You said—" "I know what I said." His voice was tight. "I'm trying to find out how the breach happened." "The breach?" She said it back and heard the edge in her own voice. "My sister is in that kitchen. Your breach is sitting 11 feet away from her. I know. Does your security team know that someone was at the perimeter last night with a camera and they didn't? They know now. Something moved through his jaw. I'm handling it. You keep saying that. She wasn't shouting. She wanted to shout. She could feel the pressure of it, the want to raise her voice and push against something. But she didn't shout because shouting wasn't useful, and she was too tired and too frightened and too angry to be anything other than exact. You keep saying you're handling it, and Salazar keeps being 11 steps ahead of where you think he is. Dante was silent. He found my building in 4 days, she said. He found this property in 3. He walked into my restaurant and sat in my private dining room and left a message on the table like he was dropping a receipt. What exactly have you been handling? The silence between them was full of something uncomfortable and necessary. There's a leak, Dante said finally. The words came out like he was cutting something loose. Someone in my network has been feeding information to Salazar. I've suspected it for 6 weeks. I haven't been able to confirm it. She stared at him. 6 weeks? Yes. You've had a leak in your network for 6 weeks, and you moved us to a property that your network knows about. He looked at her, and in his expression she saw it. The fracture, the specific crack in the control, the look of a man who has made a decision he understood was a risk, and is now standing in the full cost of it. I thought this property was compartmented, he said. Only 3 people in my organization knew the address. And one of them told Salazar. He didn't answer. She turned and walked to the kitchen doorway. Lily looked up from her laptop. She read Evelyn's face the way she'd been reading it since she was 14 years old and reached for her phone without being asked. James? Lily said. Not James, Evelyn said. Not anywhere connected to us. She thought fast, the way she thought when the kitchen was in crisis, and she had 3 seconds to make the right call. Maya, Lily's roommate from freshman year, now living in Ballard, a person with no conceivable connection to Dante or Salazar or any of this. Call Maya. Tell her you're coming. Go now. Lily closed her laptop. She didn't ask questions. She picked up her backpack and her keys, and she looked at Evelyn, and what Evelyn saw in her sister's eyes was not fear, but trust. The deep and absolute trust of someone who had learned over a lifetime that her sister's instincts were worth following even when the reasoning wasn't fully explained. Call me when you're there, Evelyn said. Lily left through the front. Cole walked her to a car. Dante had gestured to him, one of the spare compressed gestures she'd come to recognize as actual instructions rather than reflexive management. And she watched from the window as the car pulled out of the drive and onto the road north and disappeared. She stood at the window until she couldn't see it anymore. Then she turned around. Dante was watching her from the middle of the room. The 2 other men had made themselves absent. She didn't know when that had happened. She'd been focused on Lily. The 3 people who knew this address, she said. Who are they? He was still for a moment. Then he named them. A man named Breslin. Operations, 15 years, the kind of tenure that made people either invaluable or invisible. Cole, who was standing near the wall and whose expression when Dante said his name was flat and direct and gave her nothing to read. And a man named Garrett, logistics, who handled the property portfolio for the holding companies. Garrett, Cole said from the wall. His voice was quiet. Breslin was with me last night. I can account for his movements. Garrett was... A pause. Garrett had a meeting with the renovation contractor 2 days ago, on site at the restaurant. Dante looked at Cole. Something passed between them, dense and quick and too specifically coded for Evelyn to parse. The contractor's office, Dante said slowly. The contractor's assistant made copies of the site survey documents, Cole said. Full property documentation, including the waterfront address listed as the owner's contact location. He paused. The assistant has been with the firm for 4 months. 4 months. Evelyn ran the math without being asked to. Salazar had been building this for longer than 3 weeks. Longer than the business journal piece. He'd been working backward from Dante's business structure, identifying the seams, inserting people into the gaps. The renovation contractor. Her renovation. The one she had negotiated, the one whose name had come from Dante's office, the one she had trusted because it had come from him, and she had trusted him, and I chose that contractor, Dante said, and his voice had gone to the lowest register she'd heard from him. I recommended him to you. She looked at him. Salazar's been inside this since before I bought the restaurant, Dante said. The words landed one at a time, with the specific weight of a man who is not cushioning the truth. Since before I walked into Bella Rosa that night, he may have known about the acquisition before it closed. She stood completely still with that for a moment. He may have known, she said slowly, that you were going to be there that night. Dante said nothing. The dinner, she said. Your reservation at Bella Rosa. Was it? I don't know, Dante said. But the way he said it, the texture of it, the specific flatness, told her he had already asked himself this question and had not found an answer he was comfortable with. She thought about the rainy Tuesday, the way the room had changed, the way Marcus had said his name, the soup, the phone number, the check folder, the job offer the next morning within 24 hours, before he had any meaningful operational data about her beyond what he'd observed in a single evening. She thought about how fast it had all moved. She looked at Dante and she asked the question she had been not asking for 3 weeks. The question she had been filing under the category of things I will examine when I am less depleted and perpetually moving to the back of the queue. Did someone tell you to look at me specifically? She said. He met her gaze. Dante. Her voice was very quiet. Did Salazar, or someone working for Salazar, put my name in front of you before that dinner? The silence that followed was the longest she had experienced in his company, long enough that it became its own kind of answer, long enough that she could feel the shape of what it meant settling into her chest like something. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled past its tension limit, and Evelyn stood in it and waited, and Dante stood in it and did not look away. And that was the thing. He did not look away, which told her more than any answer he could have constructed in that moment. Tell me, she said. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. He moved to the window, not away from her, sideways, the way people move when they need to think with their bodies, because their minds are working too hard to stay still. He looked at the harbor. The light was low and gray, and the water was the color of old iron. 8 weeks ago, he said, I received information that Salazar was targeting someone connected to Bella Rosa, a staff member, someone he could use as leverage. He paused. The information came through a channel I trusted. It said the target was a floor manager named Evelyn Cross. She said nothing. I went in to assess, he said, to see what he was looking at, to understand why you specifically. He turned from the window. What I saw was someone running a 15-table floor alone for 5 hours on nothing, catching every failure, filling every gap, doing the job of 4 people and not once asking anyone for anything. He held her gaze. That wasn't what I expected to find. What did you expect to find? Someone more obviously vulnerable. Someone easier to read. A pause. Someone who would make more sense as a target. So you promoted me, she said. To what? Put me inside your perimeter where you could manage the threat. That was the initial reasoning, yes. The word initial sat in the room between them. And then, she said. He looked at her directly. And then it stopped being about Salazar. She breathed, in and out. She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady and hard against her ribs. She was aware of the kitchen being empty now, Lily's chair pushed back, her textbooks still stacked by the wall. You should have told me, she said. From the beginning. Yes. I walked into this without the information I needed to make a real choice. Yes. His voice was flat with the weight of it. You're right, and I can't make that right by explaining it. No, she said. You can't. She picked up her phone from the table. Lily had texted, at Maya's, door locked, don't worry, and she read it twice and set the phone back down. I need to think, she said, and I need you to not be in the same room while I do it. He left without argument. She sat in the empty kitchen for 20 minutes. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she thought about every decision she'd made in the last 3 weeks. The supplier contracts, the renovation plans, Raphael's promotion, the Monday morning meeting at the corner table, and she ran them through the new information the way you run numbers through a corrected formula, checking what changed, checking what held. The work held. Everything she'd built at Bella Rosa was real. She'd built it with her own competence, and it stood independent of how she'd been positioned to do it. The rest was more complicated. She thought about what it meant that Salazar had known about her before Dante had. that someone had handed her name to both sides of a conflict she'd had no part in, that she had been, at some point before that rainy Tuesday, a piece being moved on a board by people whose game she hadn't known she was in. She thought about the way Dante had crouched in front of her. She thought about it stopped being about Salazar. She was still thinking when Cole knocked on the kitchen doorway and told her, quietly, that there was a development. The development was a phone call. Salazar, calling through a channel that should not have existed, a direct line to a number in Dante's operational network that was supposed to be unlisted and compartmented and known to fewer than 8 people. The fact that Salazar had it was its own message, delivered before the call even connected. Dante took it on speaker in the main room. Evelyn stood to the side, out of the line of the camera if there was a camera, which there probably was. Cole stood near the door. The second man, she'd learned his name was Torres, quiet, observant, with a scar running along his left jaw that he clearly had no interest in explaining, was at the wall. Salazar's voice was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture of him from context. The surveillance, the phone call to her office, the photograph left on the table, and the picture had a specific texture to it, aggressive, blunt, the voice of someone who led through force. What she heard instead was measured, almost mild, the voice of someone who had decided long ago that composure was the more frightening instrument. "Dante," he said, "I think we're past the point of going through intermediaries." "What do you want?" Dante's voice was flat. "A conversation. In person. Tomorrow night." A pause. "Just the two of us and whoever we each need in the room. Nothing elaborate. I'm proposing the Meridian Warehouse. You know the building. You own the adjacent parcel. Neutral enough. And if I decline, then we continue the current arrangement," Salazar said, "and the next photograph I send you won't be of the house." Another pause. Lighter, almost conversational. "I understand Ms. Cross's sister has a Tuesday study group. Campus library, 5th floor, 7 to 9 p.m. Very regular schedule." Dante's jaw went rigid. She watched it happen, the muscles along the side of his face hardening in a slow, controlled sequence that was the most frightening thing she'd seen from him because it was so contained. The anger was total, and he was keeping it completely inside himself, and the effort of that was visible in every tendon in his neck. "Tomorrow night," Dante said. 9 o'clock. "Good," Salazar said. "And Dante, bring the woman. I want her in the room." The call ended. The room was very quiet. "No," Dante said. He said it to Cole, to Torres, to the room, not to her specifically, the preemptive no of someone who already knew what was coming. "He'll walk if I'm not there," Evelyn said. "I don't care." Then he goes back to the photographs. Back to the campus library on Tuesday nights. She crossed the room to stand in front of him. "He specified me because he thinks I'm a liability. He thinks having me in the room gives him leverage he can use on you in real time." She held his gaze. "So use that. Let him think he has it." Dante looked at her. "This isn't a negotiation situation. What Salazar calls a conversation. I know what it is." She said it evenly. "I'm not naive about what tomorrow night is." She watched him. "But I'm already in this. You know that. Keeping me at the edge of it doesn't make me safer. It just means I have less information while the same risks exist." The silence between them was different from the earlier one. That one had been about what hadn't been said. This one was about what both of them were weighing simultaneously. "If you're in that room," Dante said, "and something goes wrong, then we're both in a bad situation," she said, "which is already true from right here." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the calculation, the resistance, the thing underneath the resistance that wasn't strategy. "Stay close to Cole," he said finally. "Whatever happens in that room, you don't move without Cole. You understand?" "Yes. And if I tell you to leave, you leave. No argument. No waiting to see how it plays." "Agreed." He turned away and started talking to Torres, and she heard the operational language begin. The logistics, the positioning, the pre-work that needed to happen before 9 o'clock tomorrow. And she went back to the kitchen and sat down and called Lily. Lily answered on the first ring. "I'm okay," Lily said immediately, before Evelyn could say anything. "Maya's here. We made pasta. I'm fine." Evelyn closed her eyes for a second. "How's the problem set?" "Terrible. The load distribution on the cantilever section makes no physical sense, and I think the professor made an error in the parameters. A pause. Are you okay? I will be, Evelyn said. Stay at Maya's tomorrow. Don't go to campus. A longer pause. Evie? I know. I'll explain everything afterward. I promise. She could hear Lily breathing on the other end, the quiet and familiar sound of it. Her sister in a safe kitchen 40 minutes away, making the decision to trust her one more time. Okay, Lily said. Okay, Evelyn said. Get some sleep. She didn't sleep much herself. She lay in the East Room and listened to the harbor and ran scenarios the way she ran restaurant contingencies. If this, then this. If that collapses, then redirect here. She was not a person who had been trained for what tomorrow night was, and she knew that, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was a person who had spent years reading rooms, reading people, reading the gap between what people said and what they meant, and those were not nothing. She got up at 5:30. Dante was already in the kitchen. He looked at her and didn't say anything and poured her coffee and pushed it across the counter, and she took it. And they stood in the gray morning light and drank it without speaking, and something in that silence was different from all the other silences. Quieter, steadier. The silence of two people who have stopped pretending they aren't carrying this together. The day was long and operational. Cole ran preparation. She participated in the briefing, which Dante allowed without comment, and she listened carefully and asked two questions that earned her a look from Torres that she couldn't fully read but suspected was reassessment. She reviewed the building schematics for the Meridian warehouse. She noted the exits. She noted the sight lines. She asked about Salazar's typical security configuration, and Cole told her. 4 men, usually, deployed at corners, with a principal protection detail of 2 that stayed within arm's reach. He'll have more tomorrow, Dante said. He'll want the visual advantage. So will you, Cole said. We'll be even, Dante said, which means the room itself decides it. The Meridian warehouse was on the industrial waterfront south of the ferry terminal, the kind of building that had been a working facility once, and was now in the gray economy of properties that existed between their last use and their next one. It had loading bays on the south end and a central space large enough to park 8 vehicles with room to negotiate between them. The evening was clear and cold, the first genuinely cold night in 2 weeks. The harbor wind cutting in off the sound with the particular edge it got in spring when the water was still winter cold and the air hadn't fully committed to the season yet. They arrived at 8:47. Salazar was already there. This was a power move, and everyone in the room understood it as such. Arriving early to occupy the space, to be present when the other party entered, to remove the advantage of entry timing. Dante walked through the loading bay door without breaking stride, and Evelyn stayed 2 steps to his right, with Cole half a step behind her, and Torres and 2 other men flanked out in the way that Cole had described in the briefing, and she had mapped in her head. Salazar was standing near the center of the space. He was shorter than she'd imagined, maybe 5'10", compact, in a dark jacket and no tie, the kind of man whose physical presentation was deliberately understated because the understatement was itself a display. He was in his 50s, she estimated, with the composed stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this one many times and had stopped feeling the weight of them. He looked at her first, not at Dante, at her. And he smiled, small, precise, the smile of someone confirming a hypothesis. Ms. Cross, he said, I wanted to meet you properly. You called my office, she said. We've met. Something in his eyes shifted. It was small and it was fast, and she filed it. Dante stopped 12 feet from Salazar. The 4 men on Salazar's side had positioned themselves in the corners the way Cole had predicted, and the 2 principal protection detail were at Salazar's shoulders. The geometry of the room was what it was. You asked for a conversation, Dante said. I did. Salazar's voice was the same as it had been on the phone, measured, almost mild. I want to talk about what we're doing to each other, and why it doesn't need to continue. You've been running surveillance on a private property and threatening a civilian, Dante said. That's not something I negotiate around. The surveillance ends when the conversation produces an agreement, Salazar said simply, and Ms. Cross isn't a civilian anymore. She's been your operational asset for 3 weeks, whether she understood that or not. He glanced at her, though I suspect she understood it. She strikes me as someone who understands more than she's given credit for. Evelyn held his gaze and said nothing. Here's what I want, Salazar said. He was speaking to Dante, but his eyes moved back to her every few seconds, a monitoring pattern, checking her for reactions, calibrating how she registered with Dante in real time. He was looking for the leverage, locating it. The port contract that your logistics arm has been moving toward. I want a stake. 30%. In exchange, my network stays out of your legitimate operations entirely. The surveillance ends. Whatever interest I've developed in Ms. Cross and her sister disappears completely. You're asking for access to a legitimate operation in exchange for stopping behavior that's illegal under 4 separate statutes, Dante said. I'm asking for a business arrangement, Salazar said. The framing is yours. The answer is no. Salazar looked at him. Something behind the composure tightened fractionally. Dante, think about what you're protecting. He glanced at Evelyn again, longer this time, and the look was calculated to be seen. Is it worth the port contract? This isn't about the port contract, Dante said. No, Salazar said. I don't think it is. He looked at Evelyn directly now, and what was in his face was the particular expression of a man playing the card he came to play. I want you to understand something, Ms. Cross, about the man you've been trusting. He paused. The information that put your name in front of Dante 8 weeks ago, the tip that Salazar was targeting a Bellarosa staff member named Evelyn Cross. Another pause. I didn't generate that information. She felt the room shift. Your name was given to Dante by his own network, Salazar said, specifically by a man named Garrett, who was, at that point, working to build a situation that would draw Dante into a personal attachment before the port contract closed, a vulnerability, carefully constructed. He watched her face. Garrett has been my asset for 14 months, which means the vulnerability was never accidental. It was designed. And the woman standing in it, shut up, Dante said. The 2 words came out with a force that was entirely different from everything he'd said before. Not louder, just different in register. The sound of something that had been controlled for a very long time, reaching the limit of what control could contain. Salazar didn't shut up. Was chosen, he said, still looking at Evelyn, because her profile fit the parameters. Isolated, financially pressured, no family connections that could complicate things. Smart enough to be convincing, vulnerable enough to be useful. He paused. Garrett identified you 3 months before Dante walked into Bellarosa. The cold that moved through her was total and specific. Not the cold of fear, the cold of a structure collapsing. The feeling of something you had been standing on revealing itself to be unstable, not from impact, but from the slow removal of what had been holding it up all along. She thought about 3 months ago. She thought about the night she'd nearly hit the floor. She thought about the phone number on the inside of the check folder. She thought about every wall she'd let come down and what had been on the other side of each one. She didn't look at Dante. She couldn't look at Dante right now and keep her face doing what she needed her face to do. The interesting part, Salazar said, and his voice had shifted, still mild but with something underneath it now, something that was not composure but its performance, is what Dante did with the situation once it was handed to him. Because Garrett built the approach. But everything after that first night was Dante's own choice. He paused. Which might be the most inconvenient truth in this room. One of Salazar's men moved. It was small. A shift in weight, a hand going to a jacket. And Cole moved simultaneously, and the geometry of the room changed in the space of 2 seconds, all of it happening below the level of raised voices or explicit signals, the entire arrangement becoming something else in the time it takes to blink. Dante stepped forward, not toward Salazar's man, toward Salazar. 1 step, deliberate and unhurried, and somehow more threatening than anything faster would have been. You're going to end the surveillance, Dante said. You're going to pull your people from every location connected to her. You're going to close every file you've built on Evelyn Cross and her sister. And you're going to confirm to me, in terms I can verify, that it's done. Salazar held his gaze. Or what? Or the conversation we've been delaying for 3 years happens tonight, Dante said. And I'm prepared for tonight. The warehouse was very still. Outside, the harbor wind moved against the metal walls and made the building creak once, low and slow. Salazar looked at Dante. He looked at Cole, at Torres, at the men positioned behind Dante. He looked at Evelyn. One more look, assessing, checking whether she was the fracture point he'd come here believing she was. She looked back at him and gave him nothing. His eyes moved back to Dante. And something in the composure shifted. Not broke, not collapsed, but moved. The recalculation happening in real time, visible in the microscopic adjustments of a face that had spent decades not showing its workings. "The port contract," Salazar said. "No," Dante said. "Then what?" "The surveillance ends," Dante said. "Tonight. In exchange for that, I don't pursue what Garrett gave me before he was removed from my network. There's enough there to create significant problems for your logistics operation. We both walk away from what we're holding, and we don't touch each other's operations going forward." He paused. "That's the offer. It doesn't get better." The silence was 30 seconds long. Evelyn counted it. Salazar looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "The surveillance ends tonight," he said. "Tonight," Dante confirmed. "And Garrett?" "Garrett is no longer my concern," Dante said. "Or yours." Something passed across Salazar's face that might have been relief and might have been calculation and was probably both. He looked once more at Evelyn. The last look, the one that was checking whether she was going to be a problem going forward, whether she was contained, and she held his gaze and kept her face exactly as still as she had kept it for the last 10 minutes and gave him nothing to work with. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting terms he'd calculated he couldn't improve. He turned and walked toward the south loading bay. His men fell in around him with the practiced ease of people who had done this exit many times. The door opened and the harbor wind came in cold and cut through the warehouse, and then the door closed and they were gone. The room exhaled. Torres said something to Cole in a low voice. Cole answered. One of the other men moved toward the door they'd entered through and took up a position there. Operational, automatic, the machinery continuing to run. Dante turned to Evelyn. She was looking at the empty center of the warehouse where Salazar had been standing. She was very still. She could feel her own heartbeat, elevated, the physical aftermath of sustained tension beginning to metabolize into the specific exhaustion that follows adrenaline. She could feel Dante looking at her. She turned and met his eyes. And she saw it in his face, not the controlled weight she'd learned to read over 3 weeks, not the operational composure, not the managed distance. What she saw was the face of someone stripped of every layer of construction, standing in the consequence of every choice that had led to this room, and not looking away from any of it. The things Salazar said, Dante started. Don't, she said. Not here. Evelyn, not here, she said again. Her voice was steady, and she meant the steadiness. Get me out of this building first. He got her out. The SUV was cold, the heater running from the moment Torres started the engine, and the city moved past the windows, the waterfront, the illuminated bridges, the neighborhoods stacked up the hillside with their ordinary lit windows and their ordinary contained lives. And she sat in the back seat and looked at it and felt the full weight of the last 3 weeks pressing against her chest like something that needed to be. The SUV moved through the city and nobody spoke. Torres drove with the particular focused quiet of someone who understood that the silence in the back seat was not his to fill. Cole was in the passenger seat, eyes forward, one hand resting on his knee with the stillness of a man standing down from high alert 1 degree at a time. Outside, Seattle moved past in the way cities move past car windows at night, fragmentary, luminous, the lit windows of buildings that contained other people's ordinary lives going on without interruption or consequence. Evelyn watched it. She was aware of Dante beside her, not touching, a foot of space between them on the back seat, but present in the way that large things are present even when they're still. She could hear him breathing. She could feel the tension in him that hadn't fully released when Salazar walked out of the warehouse. Because the tension wasn't about Salazar. It hadn't been about Salazar for a while. She didn't look at him. She looked at the city and she thought about Garrett, a name she'd heard twice. Once when Dante had listed the 3 people who knew the waterfront property address, and once from Salazar's mouth in the warehouse, shaped into a weapon and aimed at the gap between her and the man sitting beside her. Garrett, who had been feeding information to Salazar for 14 months. Garrett, who had identified her 3 months before a rainy Tuesday in April. Garrett, who had built the approach and handed it to both sides of a conflict she'd been living inside without a map. She thought about the profile Salazar had described: isolated, financially pressured, no family connections that could complicate things, smart enough to be convincing, vulnerable enough to be useful. She turned it over slowly, the way you turn something sharp over to understand all the edges. The thing was, and she'd been sitting with this since the warehouse, letting it settle into its actual shape instead of the shape fear tried to give it. The thing was that the profile was accurate. Those were true facts about her life. The isolation, the money, Lily as the one soft point in an otherwise hardened perimeter. Garrett had read her correctly. Salazar had read her correctly. What neither of them had fully accounted for was what those facts had produced in her over 26 years of living with them. Because isolation didn't only create vulnerability, it also created self-sufficiency so deep it had calcified into something structural. And financial pressure didn't only create desperation, it also created a clarity of judgment about what things were actually worth and what they weren't, a calibration that came from having made real trade-offs in real conditions and not from theory. They had found her pressure points, and they had underestimated what she'd built on top of them. She was still thinking about this when the SUV stopped at the waterfront property and Torres cut the engine. She got out without waiting for anyone to open the door. Inside the house was quiet. The kitchen light was on. She'd left it on. She always left a light on. The habit of someone who had spent enough nights coming home to dark apartments that she'd decided years ago to always leave something burning when she left. The harbor was visible through the main room windows, the water dark and moving, the distant lights of the ferry terminal smearing orange gold across the surface. She went to the kitchen. She filled a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the sink. She heard Dante come in behind her. She heard Torres and Cole continue through to the back of the house, the quiet professional withdrawal of people who understood when a room needed to be smaller. She set the glass down. "Say it," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the harbor through the kitchen window, the same view she'd been looking at for 4 days, the view that had started to feel familiar in the way that temporary things sometimes became familiar before you had time to guard against it. "Whatever you've been holding since the warehouse, say it." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him move, not toward her, to the other side of the kitchen, putting the table between them not as a barrier but as a structural acknowledgement that this conversation needed some space around it. "Garrett came to me 7 weeks before the acquisition," he said. "He told me there was a person on the Bellarosa staff that Salazar had flagged as a potential leverage point. He gave me your name and your file." A pause. "I believed the threat was real because I had no reason not to. Garrett had been reliable for 6 years." "And what did you intend to do about it?" she said. "Assess. Verify. If the threat was real, offer the person some form of protection without exposing the full context." He paused. "That was the intention going in. And coming out," a longer pause. "Coming out was different," he said. She turned from the window. He was standing on the far side of the kitchen table with his hands resting on the back of a chair, and in the kitchen light she could see everything the warehouse had stripped off him. The composed weight, the controlled distance, all of it. He looked tired in a way that was deeper than one night's events. The tiredness of someone who had been carrying a specific thing for a long time and had just been asked to set it down in front of another person. "I walked into Bellarosa expecting to see someone who fit a threat profile," he said. "Someone who could be managed, relocated if necessary, protected from a distance, a problem to be solved." He held her gaze. "What I saw was someone running a failing operation back from the edge on sheer will, checking my plate personally at the end of a 9-hour shift, and then nearly hitting the floor from exhaustion and telling me she was fine." He paused. "That wasn't a profile. That was a person." "And the job," she said. "The promotion. Part of it was practical, genuine. You were the right person. The assessment was real." He didn't look away. "Part of it was that I wanted you somewhere I could account for your safety without manufacturing a reason to be in your vicinity." He paused. "And part of it, the part I should have named earlier, was that I wanted to keep seeing you." The kitchen was very quiet. "You should have told me," she said, "about Garrett, about why you came in." "Yes. I made decisions based on incomplete information. You let me do that." "Yes." His voice was level and carried no defense, and she understood that this was not passivity. He was not someone who defaulted to agreement under pressure. He was someone who had looked at the full ledger and was not disputing the balance. I don't do well with being managed, she said. I told you that. You did. And you managed me anyway. With good intentions, maybe. But the intentions don't change what it was. No, he said. They don't. She looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about every version of this conversation she'd run in her head in the back of the SUV, the different shapes it could take, the different places it could land. Here's what I know, she said. I know that Garrett built the approach. I know that what Salazar described, the profile, the positioning, was real. I know that I was put in front of you as a piece in someone else's game. She paused. I also know that a piece in someone else's game doesn't have the ability to negotiate its own employment terms. Doesn't tell the man running the game what she'll accept and what she won't. Doesn't run his restaurant back to profitability in 3 weeks on her own competence. She held his gaze. I stopped being Garrett's piece the moment I picked up the phone and called your assistant with conditions. He was very still. That doesn't make everything you withheld acceptable, she said. I want to be clear about that. It's not. And if there's a next time, any next time, about anything, I need the real information, not the version you decide I can handle. There won't be a next time, he said. Not like this. How do I know that? He looked at her. Because I'm telling you, and because you're someone who reads people accurately, and you can read whether I mean it. She held his gaze for a long moment. She read him the way she'd been reading him since the first night, carefully, with the specific attention she gave to things that mattered, looking for the gap between performance and truth. She didn't find a gap. Okay, she said. He breathed. It was small and she almost didn't catch it, but she was standing close enough by now that she did. She called Lily at 9:40. Lily answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. Tell me, Lily said. It's over, Evelyn said. The situation is resolved. You can go back to the apartment tomorrow. She paused. I'll explain everything when I see you. All of it. All of it, Lily said. Including the man. Evelyn was quiet for a second. What man? Evie. Lily's voice carried the particular exasperation of someone who was 23 and considerably less foolish than she was sometimes given credit for. You've been at a secure waterfront property for 4 days. You called me from there the first night, and I could hear someone else in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. And every time you've said the situation, you say it in this specific way that means there's a person attached to it. A pause. I'm studying structural engineering. I can identify load-bearing elements. Evelyn leaned against the hallway wall. She heard from the kitchen the quiet sound of Dante moving, the tap running, the small domestic sounds of someone making coffee at an hour when coffee was unnecessary, but something to do with the hands was not. Get some sleep, Evelyn said. I'll see you tomorrow. I want to meet him, Lily said. Good night, Lily. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand and something moving through her chest that was not entirely comfortable and was not entirely unpleasant. The feeling of a wall that has been standing for a very long time, beginning to understand that it is allowed to be something else. She went back to the kitchen. The next 2 weeks were not simple. She had not expected them to be simple, and the fact that they weren't confirmed something she'd suspected about herself, that she was better at navigating actual difficulty than she was at navigating the absence of it. When things were straightforwardly hard, she knew what to do. When the hardness became complicated and personal and involved another person in ways that couldn't be managed through operational efficiency, she was less practiced. She went back to the apartment. She and Lily sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, and she told Lily everything. The real version, not the managed one. And Lily listened the way Lily listened, with total attention and no interruption, and when Evelyn finished, Lily was quiet for a moment and then said, So Garrett used you as a pawn, and Salazar tried to use you as a weapon, and Dante used you as a person he wanted to keep safe, and also, apparently, wanted to be around. And none of them asked you first. That's accurate, Evelyn said. And you're still going back to Bellarosa. It's my restaurant, Evelyn said. I built it into something. That doesn't stop being true because of how I got there. Lily looked at her. And the other part? The other part is more complicated. The complicated parts are always the real ones, Lily said. She stood up and put the kettle on and said nothing else, which was its own form of wisdom. Evelyn went back to Bellarosa on a Monday morning, 9 o'clock, the same time she'd walked in for the first meeting with Dante. She stood at the hose stand and looked at the room in the morning light. The water stain was gone, repaired during the days she'd been away, and the banquette cushions had been replaced on the east wall. And the renovation contractor, the new contractor, the one she'd sourced herself this time, independently, using her own research, had begun the preliminary kitchen work with a timeline she'd verified personally. The room was better. Not finished, not perfect, but better than it had been, and better by specific increments she could account for and name. Raphael appeared from the kitchen at 9:15 and updated her on the previous week's service. The numbers, the staffing, a supplier delivery that had arrived short on quantity, which he documented and which she made a note to address. He looked at her while he talked with the direct confidence of someone who had discovered recently that their judgment was trusted and had recalibrated accordingly. "Good week?" she said. "Good week," he agreed. Marcus appeared with coffee and the reservation book and the particular air of someone who had questions he was too professional to ask directly. And she let him have the professional discretion and answered only the operational ones, and that was enough. Dante came in at noon, not for a meeting. He sat at the corner table, his, still, apparently permanently, and ordered lunch and read from his tablet and didn't ask for her specifically. She noticed him the way she always noticed him, which was the way you notice something that has established itself as a consistent feature of the landscape. You don't stop seeing it, you just integrate it. She brought the check herself when he finished. He looked up. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He held her gaze. "How's it sitting, being back?" "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "The kitchen repairs are on schedule. Raphael's running clean. We're up 22% on covers." "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. The dining room moved around them. The ambient noise, the lunchtime rhythm, the sound of her restaurant doing what it was supposed to do. "It's sitting okay," she said. "I'm still sorting some of it, but the work is real. That's what I needed to be true." "And the rest?" She paused. "The rest I'll get to on my own timeline." "Fair enough," he said. She left the check and went back to work. Her own timeline turned out to be approximately 11 days. 11 days during which she ran the restaurant and handled the renovation coordination and renegotiated the last of the supplier contracts and promoted Marcus to a deputy manager role she'd designed herself, a role that would give him the authority he'd been exercising informally for years and compensate him at a level that reflected it. 11 days during which Dante came into the restaurant 4 times and sat at the corner table and didn't pressure anything, didn't perform patience, just existed in the space with the same self-contained qualities she'd been reading since April, and waited for whatever she decided without making the waiting visible. On the 11th day, she called him. Not from the restaurant. From her apartment evening, Lily out at James's, the kitchen quiet. She called his direct number, which she had now, which he'd given her without ceremony one afternoon as a matter of practical contact, and which she'd used twice for operational purposes. He answered on the second ring. "I want to have a conversation that isn't about the restaurant," she said. A pause. "When?" "Tonight, if you're available." He was available. He came to her apartment, which felt significant in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. The waterfront house had been neutral ground, and the restaurant was hers, but also professional. The apartment was her actual life. The third-floor walk-up with the perpetually unrenovated hallways, and the neighbors' cooking smells, and Lily's textbooks still stacked on the hall table, and the kitchen where she'd eaten half a banana on a Friday morning and called it enough. He looked at it without comment, without the performed neutrality of someone editing their reaction. He just looked at it the way he looked at everything, directly, with full attention, taking it in as it actually was. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. "I need to ask you something, and I need a complete answer," she said. "Ask it. If Garrett hadn't put my name in front of you, if Salazar hadn't been looking at Bellarosa, if it had just been a normal Tuesday night, and you'd come in for dinner, and I'd run your table and you'd paid and left." She held his gaze. Would any of this have happened? He was quiet for a moment. She didn't rush it. She'd asked for a complete answer, and complete answers needed space. "I don't know," he said. "Honestly, I don't know what I would have noticed or what I would have done with what I noticed in a situation without stakes." He paused. "I know that what I noticed in that situation, with those stakes, was real." What I saw in you that night wasn't manufactured by the context. The context just meant I was paying a particular kind of attention. And if the attention had been different, then maybe I walk out and I spend the next 2 weeks thinking about the woman who ran the floor alone and checked my plate and told me she was fine when she wasn't, and I don't do anything with it. He looked at her directly. Or maybe I come back for dinner on a Wednesday. I can't tell you which. I can tell you that what developed after that first night, that was mine. Not Garrett's, not Salazar's, mine. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen window. No harbor view here, just the building across the alley. The ordinary geometry of city life stacked on city life. She thought about the broken heel on her bedroom floor, the $47, the granola bar at 11 a.m. She thought about what it had cost her to build the life she had, the precise and grinding and unglamorous cost of it, and how that cost had shaped her into someone who did not hand trust over easily because trust had to be earned against a standard she'd developed by having it violated. She thought about what it meant that after everything, Garrett, Salazar, the managed information, the position she'd been placed in without consent, she was sitting at her own kitchen table and she still believed him. Not blindly, not completely. With the clear-eyed, provisional, evidence-based belief of someone who had read a person carefully over weeks and arrived at a conclusion she was prepared to stand behind and revise if the evidence required it. I'm going to need it to be slow, she said. Whatever this is. Okay. Not because I'm uncertain about what I want, because I need to build the foundation the right way. I need it to be mine. I understand that, he said, and I need you to keep telling me the truth, even when you think the truth is going to cost you something. She held his gaze, especially then. Yes, he said. He said it simply, without elaboration, and she believed it not because it was said simply, but because she'd spent weeks learning how this man's face looked when he meant something versus when he was managing a situation, and this was the former. Okay, she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between them. A book. Small, old, with a cloth spine and the particular worn quality of something that had been handled by many hands over many years. She looked at it without touching it for a moment. The cover read, in faded gilt lettering, the name of a French chef she'd mentioned once, in passing. She'd mentioned it as a throwaway, a brief reference to a book she'd looked at in a used bookstore as a teenager and couldn't afford and had thought about occasionally since. How? She said. I listened, he said. I've been listening to everything you said. She picked up the book. It was a first edition. She could tell from the publication information, from the quality of the paper, from the specific age of the binding. She turned it over in her hands. She opened it carefully and looked at the frontispiece, and then she closed it and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Nobody had given her anything like this. Not because nobody had wanted to. Lily would give her everything she had if Evelyn let her, but because she had spent so long making herself self-sufficient that the people around her had accepted self-sufficiency as the final word. Nobody had looked past the competence to the girl who'd stood in a used bookstore at 17 and touched the spine of a book she couldn't have. He had looked past it. He had looked at it, filed it, and held it for weeks. She set the book down and looked at him across the kitchen table. She looked at his face, the tired eyes, the jaw that carried weight, the hands resting still on the table, the specific quality of a man who had stopped performing and was just sitting in her kitchen being what he was. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. A car on the street below. The distant complaint of the freight elevator in the building across the alley, which had apparently been repaired sometime in the last month. The specific quiet of a Tuesday evening in a neighborhood that didn't have much reason to be loud. She thought about the word invisible, the way she'd felt it for years, the specific texture of moving through spaces and being necessary to their function and simultaneously unseen by them. She thought about the long tally of shifts and rent checks and granola bars and broken heels and course fees she'd quietly absorbed for half a decade, the full and grinding weight of a life built entirely on the back of her own endurance. She thought about the night she'd nearly hit the floor. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the Salazar situation, not the warehouse, but here, this kitchen, this table, this person across from her who had a reputation that could reshape a room when he entered it, and who was currently sitting with a coffee cup going cold and his jacket still on because she hadn't told him he could take it off, and he was apparently the kind of man who waited to be told. "You can take your jacket off," she said. He looked at her for a second. Something in his expression shifted. Not the dramatic shift of a scene change, just a small internal movement, like a piece that had been held in tension being allowed to settle. He took his jacket off and set it on the back of the chair. They sat for another hour. They talked about Lily. She told him things she hadn't told him before, the years before Lily's scholarship, the specific choices she'd made and not made, the weight that had been so constant for so long that she'd stopped experiencing it as a weight and started experiencing it as just the baseline condition of being alive. He listened without managing it, without shaping his response toward reassurance, without performing empathy. He listened the way he'd listened from the beginning, which was actually completely, without visible agenda. He told her things too. Not everything. That would take longer than one evening, and she didn't expect everything in one evening, but pieces. His father, who had built the original network and handed it to him at 27 with the particular inheritance of men who are given something they never asked for and are expected to be grateful. The years of calculating how to make legitimate what had been built through means he couldn't undo, but could refuse to continue. The specific loneliness of an empire, which was not the same as the loneliness of poverty, but was loneliness nonetheless. The absence of anyone in your immediate vicinity who saw you separate from what you controlled. "My sister wants to meet you," she said at one point. He looked at her. "Is that an invitation or a warning?" "Both," she said. She's not intimidated by anything. She'll ask you questions that are completely direct, and she'll read your answers at a level most people aren't operating at." She paused. "She's the person I trust most in my life. So if you want to be in my life, she's part of the terms." He was quiet for a moment. "When?" he said. "Saturday, maybe? She comes here for dinner most Saturdays. I'll cook." She looked at him. "You could come." "I'll be there," he said. She nodded. She stood up to refill the coffee, and he stood up at the same time, and they were briefly in the same small space in the kitchen, closer than the table, the ordinary near collision of two people in a kitchen not designed for company. And she was aware of him with the full-body awareness she'd been managing since April, the specific gravitational quality of his proximity. She looked up at him. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the warehouse when the composure had stripped away, directly, without management, with everything present. He touched her face. Once, briefly, his hand against her jaw with a gentleness that sat at odds with everything else about him and was somehow exactly right. She didn't step back. She held still and let herself feel it, the warmth of it, the care in it, the fact that a hand could be that careful. Then she stepped back and refilled the coffee and set his cup on the counter, and they went back to the table. She did not need the gesture to be more than it was. It was enough as it was. He left at 11. At the door he stopped and looked at her one more time, the look she'd come to know as his actual face, the one underneath all the other faces. And she held it and gave it back to him, and then he went down the stairs and she heard the front door close below. She stood in her kitchen. She looked at the first edition cookbook on the table. She looked at the kitchen window. She looked at the chair where he'd sat with his jacket off. She thought about what it cost to let something matter, the specific risk of it, how you had to expose the calculation to get to the real thing, how you had to allow someone past the self-sufficiency that had kept you functional for years. She'd spent a long time making herself necessary and self-contained and hard to hurt, and she still believed in all of those qualities. They hadn't been errors, they'd been what was required. But requirements change. That was the thing she'd been learning at 26, after years of refusing to learn it because learning it felt like vulnerability. Requirements change, and what you built to survive the old requirements doesn't have to be the entire permanent architecture of your life. She picked up the cookbook and took it to her room. She set it on the nightstand beside the lamp. She looked at it for a moment, the worn cloth spine, the gilt lettering, the evidence of every hand that had turned these pages before hers, something given carefully by someone who had been paying attention to what she was, not only to what she could do. She changed out of her work clothes. She sat on the edge of the bed in the same place she'd sat on the night the heel had finally broken, in the same apartment, in the same life. Everything was different, not fixed, She was too honest with herself to reach for that word. Her bank account had recovered, but she was still 3 missed paychecks from genuine crisis. Still the person Lily called first, still building something at Bellarosa that was real and hers, but was also new enough to be fragile. Dante was in her life in a way she still didn't have complete language for. There were things between them that would take time. The full weight of what Garrett had done, the management she hadn't consented to, the slow work of building trust in both directions under conditions that hadn't been designed for it. None of that was resolved, but she sat on the edge of the bed and she felt, underneath all of it, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. She'd always distrusted happiness as a category, too complete, too finished. Something more like the feeling of a direction, a genuine and chosen direction, arrived at not because it was offered or imposed or manufactured, but because she had navigated the full complexity of a situation that had tried to use her as a piece and had instead produced something she'd built with her own judgment and her own hands. She lay back. She looked at the ceiling. Outside, Seattle made its sounds. The city that had been her only landscape for her entire adult life. The city where she had been invisible and exhausted and necessary and underestimated. The city where she had nearly fallen on a Tuesday night and had been caught by someone paying full attention. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had never been invisible. She'd been unseen by people who weren't looking. That was a different thing, and she'd spent too many years blaming herself for the distinction. She closed her eyes. The harbor was out there somewhere beyond the buildings, moving in the dark the way it always moved. Indifferent, continuous, older than every decision made on its shore. The fairy lights were crossing it right now without knowing she existed. The water didn't care about Bellarosa or Victor Salazar or Garrett or Broken Heels or granola bars or first edition cookbooks. The water just moved. She was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, at rest. Not done, not finished, not arrived at some complete and permanent peace. Just at rest. Carrying her weight consciously with both hands, knowing what it was and choosing it anyway. She thought about Saturday, about Lily at this table asking questions in her direct and merciless and loving way, about the cookbook on the nightstand, about a kitchen where she had built something real out of nothing, with no tools except the ones she'd developed in years of circumstances she hadn't asked for. She thought about what it meant to choose a life rather than just endure it. She thought she might be learning. She fell asleep with the lamp still on. And for once, she did not dream of kitchens running without enough hands, of rent calculations, of Lily's tuition deadlines. She dreamed instead of the harbor in the early morning, the flat silver light of it, the way Seattle looked at 6 a.m. before anything had been decided yet, when the day was still only possibility and the water held the whole city's reflection without judgment, patient and wide and endlessly, quietly receiving. The light came in at 7. She got up.